Hello! How are we all getting in the Christmas spirit? I'm doing it by contracting seasonal flu, which I think is very festive. Fortunately, today's video is about the speed that my brain is running at, which is slow. I've been thinking about slowness a fair bit because obviously it's a time of the year when we make our best of the year lists. And one of my favourite films of the year is Sean Baker's The Florida Project. It's a very, very beautiful film about a group of children living unknowingly, almost happily in poverty in the shadow of the happiest place on earth, Disneyland. And it completely avoids all of the cliches that you would expect to have in a social realist film about child poverty. It doesn't duck any of the tougher issues about how these families survive, but at the same time it leaves you with this great feeling of positivity. It feels like a great celebration of innocence and resilience without being condescending, and it's just beautifully shot as well. There's been some curious discourse about it, some of which has reached the director Sean Baker. In his interview in last month's Sight and Sound, he says, "A lot of people are saying it feels like a documentary, but we have lockdown shots that are sometimes very symmetrically framed and obviously very calculated in their framing." It's a fair point, although you'd have to say that having a static camera doesn't necessarily mean you're not shooting in a documentary style. I mean, all of Errol Morris's documentaries have a static camera. But later on in the same issue of Sight and Sound, the film itself is reviewed by Kate Stables, and although she doesn't say that the film is documentary style, she does credit Baker for what she describes as a slow cinema approach. I thought that was a bit weird. I mean, I thought the near 2-hour length of the Florida Project passed in a breeze. I never thought that I was looking at anything that was particularly slow. But I can sort of understand why Stables said that. To understand it, we're going to have to ask 3 questions. Firstly, obviously, is the Florida Project actually slow? Secondly, if it isn't slow, why do people think it is? And finally, why does it matter if a film's slow or not? Let's tackle that last one first. Slow cinema's become a bit of a buzz phrase among certain cinephiles. The AV Festival, which does such great work taking major new art house films and video artwork up to north where we have, did a whole slow cinema season a few years back. It's also had, I think, a deserved backlash. There's a sense in certain film criticism circles that slowness and the styles that are accompanied by slowness, which tends towards, natural light, a very flat, disaffected mode of delivering dialogue, a tendency towards bleak subject matter, somehow confers intelligence upon a film. I think that's almost a critical system that's open to abuse. If you tell people that there's one particular style of filmmaking that is cleverer than all the rest, people will make films in that style purely to be considered clever. And sure enough, I have seen some slow films which have struck me as being vapid and having nothing to say about anything, but which have been reviewed as if they were making major artistic statements purely because they look like we assume a clever film looks. The slow cinema style developed from mid-20th century art house directors like Michelangelo Antonioni. Today it's associated with people like Andrei Tarkovsky, Theo Angelopoulos, Bela Tarr. I have enjoyed some of these films, but they tend to be the ones from directors from further east, people like Apichat Pongwirasethakul, the late great Abbas Kiarostami, Kiddu Kim. I think the difference for me is that the Eastern directors' slow cinema feels less punitive than the European ones. With the Eastern directors, I feel like they're doing it because they genuinely love the images they're capturing and want you to focus on them and concentrate on them. That's not to say that never happens in Western slow cinema. You can say that that happens in certain Tarkovsky films. But too often there's a sense that the director is being slow just to guilt trip you into admitting you don't have the patience for it. There's a great review of The Silence of Lorna by the Dardenne brothers, by The Observer's late veteran film critic Philip French. And I have to say I don't agree with this as an assessment of the Dardennes, but I do think it's a useful observation to have to hand when you're discussing slow cinema as a movement. There is something admirably pure in their artistic resolve, but also something puritanical in the implied suggestion that if we balk at their aesthetic austerity, our moral seriousness is brought into question. As I say, I think there's a lot of truth in that. In terms of whether the Florida Project is actually slow, it depends on what you're measuring it against. Like a lot of people, the first of Sean Baker's films I saw was Tangerine, his extraordinarily entertaining, what would you call it? I guess transgender sex worker iPhone revenge comedy. It's a genre now. The Florida Project is certainly slower compared to that. Part of the reason is because the iPhone as a medium tends to drop frames. It makes movements look quicker than it does when it's projected at a standard 24 or 25 frames per second. Even beyond the fact that Tangerine was shot on an iPhone and the Florida Project is shot on 35mm, the narrative, the framing, the way that the scenes are edited is slower, and it's not just a matter of there being longer in between cuts either. The length in between cuts is quite a bad way of deciding whether a film is slow, in my opinion. It's one thing to say, this film is slow, it has a static, unmoving frame, the shot lasts for a good length of time. That could be describing an old silent comedy, and I don't really think Charlie Chaplin was trying to do the same thing as Bela Tarr. The difference, of course, is that the motion within the frame in a Charlie Chaplin film is normally quite energetic and up-tempo, and the motion within the frame in a Bela Tarr film is normally not. So it's clearly more than just length of shot. In Tangerine, you have scenes where the camera is moving. Not only that, where the camera is moving and following the subjects of the film as they rush from one place to another. There's a lot of very energetic music, which admittedly there is in the Florida Project, which has a lot of sort of trap and hip-hop on the soundtrack. But that's diegetic music, meaning that it's music that the characters have actually put on and listened to. Non-diegetic music is the film's score, and obviously has a more important role in setting what the director's opinion of the film's tone and mood and pace is. There's a lot of very energetic non-diegetic music in Tangerine. Say that 10 times fast. In the Florida Project, the music tends to stop at the end of each scene. Generally, there's no bleed over in terms of either the music or the dialogue into the next scene. There's a sense almost of the film becoming a scrapbook. Every shot is a little self-contained diorama. When it's over, that's it. So that can lend to a sense of slowness, and it can lend to a sense of being documentary style, even though, as Baker says, the style of it is not the cinema verite style that most people associate with documentary. I think another thing that might make people think the Florida Project is shot in a documentary style is simply the fact that it is very interested in working class, working people's working lives, which is something that narrative cinema is increasingly disinterested in. When we see the manager of the hotel where the characters live taking out bedbug infested mattresses or cleaning windows, it's easy to say that feels like a documentary, because a documentary is increasingly the only place where we see these kind of things happen in cinema. But Baker is of course right to say that having narrative similarities to a documentary does not make your film documentary style. I don't think the Florida project is slow at all, but then that's largely because of the movement within the frame, which tends to be kids running about, giggling, yelling things, misbehaving, a lot of very high energy stuff. I also think I probably found it fast and absorbing because of the circumstances I saw it in, which was at a cinema. It's something that isn't really discussed in a lot of debates about slow cinema, but when you are in a cinema looking at a screen which effectively fills your field of vision and you are concentrating on every piece of motion, every detail within that frame, yes, that does make it appear faster than it does when you've got it open in a window on your computer or you're watching it on television and also being half distracted by your phone. I imagine that when the Florida project makes it onto home release and then TV, there probably will be a lot more people who see it as a slow film because it doesn't have the standard hooks of a strong narrative or any kind of action scene that might break through the sort of half watching that people often do when they're watching a film at home. I think for me, this is why slow cinema is actually something that has to be seen on the big screen. I know when we debate what is cinematic and what are the sort of films that can drag people away from Netflix and back out for an old-fashioned cinema experience, the debate tends to be around spectacle. Wonder Woman is a film you have to see on the big screen. Kiarostami's 10 is not. Except it sort of is. And I'm not even joking here. I've had so many wonderful cinema experiences where I've been watching something that is slow and contemplative. And the fact that I was seeing it on the big screen made it so much more absorbing and magical. Mad Max Fury Road looks pretty great whatever you're watching it on. But something like Kiddo Kim's 3 Iron, that's a cinema experience, and I think when they do the next round of adverts at whatever your local multiplex is, talking about films that have to be seen on the big screen, they should absolutely take that into account. Yeah, I'd go for it.